October 11th, 1943. The sky above Wewak, New Guinea, stretched clear and blue at 28,000 feet. Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby sat in the cramped cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, the massive radial engine vibrating through his seat as 4 Thunderbolts cruised westward into enemy territory. The temperature at this altitude hovered around -20 degrees, but sweat formed along his collar. His fuel gauge already showed the drop tanks nearly empty. Below, the Japanese stronghold of Wewak sprawled across the coastline. Enemy airfields dotted the terrain. Somewhere down there, dozens of Japanese fighters waited. Kirby checked his instruments one more time. The big Pratt & Whitney engine rumbled steadily ahead of him. His right hand rested on the stick, his left near the throttle. 8 50 caliber machine guns sat loaded in the wings, 250 rounds per gun. He glanced at his wingman, Captain John Moore, flying tight formation off his right side. Behind them, Major Raymond Gallagher and Captain Bill Dunham held position. 4 American fighters, deep in enemy airspace, low on fuel. This was not the plan. The reconnaissance mission had gone smoothly. They had observed enemy installations at 4 different airfields around Wewak. They had gathered the tactical information 5th Air Force needed. The smart move was to turn back now, return towards Drome in Papua New Guinea, file their reports, and let someone else worry about the Japanese buildup. But Kirby had not flown all this way just to take photographs. For weeks, General George Kenney's fighters had dominated these skies so completely that Japanese aircraft rarely rose to challenge them. Enemy pilots stayed on the ground. American fighter pilots returned to base with full ammunition loads and empty gun cameras. Kirby wanted to change that. He keyed his radio. "Drop your wing tanks. Prepare for action." The external fuel tanks fell away from all 4 Thunderbolts, tumbling toward the jungle below. Their range just got cut in half. Whatever happened next needed to happen fast. Kirby pushed the stick forward slightly, beginning a gentle descent. His eyes scanned the sky ahead. The morning sun sat behind them, perfect position for an attack. Any Japanese pilot looking east would be staring straight into blinding light. Then he saw it. A single aircraft, more than a mile below, off to the left. The plane flew a lazy patrol pattern, oblivious to the 4 predators diving from above. Kirby rolled the Thunderbolt into a steep dive. The big fighter responded instantly, despite its massive weight. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly, 400 miles per hour, 420, 440. The altimeter unwound as the P-47 plunged downward. The lone aircraft grew larger in his windscreen. Red circles appeared on its wings, Japanese markings. Kirby's finger moved to the trigger. The range closed to 200 yards. 100, he squeezed. All 8 machine guns erupted simultaneously, the recoil shuddering through the airframe. Tracers reached out across the sky. The enemy fighter, a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, staggered under the impact. Smoke poured from its engine. Flames erupted along the fuselage. The Oscar rolled inverted and spiraled toward the jungle below. Kirby pulled back hard on the stick, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. The Thunderbolt's climb rate was poor, but its energy retention in a zoom climb was excellent. He gained altitude rapidly, bleeding off the speed from his dive. His eyes swept the sky, looking for the next target. What he saw made his blood run cold. Aircraft everywhere. Dozens of them. More than 24 Japanese fighters filled the sky ahead, maybe 3 miles distant. And below them, a formation of bombers. 12 twin-engine aircraft in tight formation. 36 fighters flying escort. The Japanese had been waiting for them. Lieutenant Colonel Tamiya Teranishi had scrambled every available fighter when radar detected the incoming American aircraft. He had climbed into an Oscar himself and led the interception force aloft. Now, his fighters orbited above Wewak, a swarm of Oscars and Tonys ready to pounce on any American aircraft foolish enough to challenge them. Teranishi had no way of knowing that only 4 P-47s had penetrated his airspace. He had no way of knowing that the Americans had just committed themselves to battle by dropping their external fuel tanks. He had no way of knowing that the tall Texan leading those 4 Thunderbolts had just decided to attack anyway. The mathematics was simple. 48 Japanese aircraft against 4 American fighters. 12-1 odds. Fuel running low. Mission already completed. Every tactical manual ever written said the same thing. Disengage, run, live to fight another day. Kirby looked at those numbers and made a different calculation. He keyed his radio again. His voice came through steady and calm. "We attack. The 4 Thunderbolts dove as one." Kirby's tactical thinking was sound, even if his decision seemed suicidal. The P-47 had specific advantages. It could not turn with the nimble Japanese fighters. It could not climb with them at low altitude, but it could dive faster than anything in the sky, and it could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. The key was to maintain energy, stay fast, hit hard, and never get into a turning fight. Kirby had trained his pilots in these tactics for months. Now they would find out if theory matched reality. The Thunderbolts came screaming down from above and behind, diving out of the sun. The Japanese pilots never saw them coming. Kirby selected a Tony, one of the Kawasaki Ki-61 fighters escorting the bombers. He opened fire at 400 yards. The heavy .50 caliber rounds walked across the sky and smashed into the Tony's fuselage. The Japanese fighter came apart in mid-air. Kirby was already selecting his next target. Another Tony crossed his nose. He fired a short burst. The enemy plane staggered, trailing smoke. He fired again. The Tony exploded. Moore and Gallagher were scoring hits too. 3 Japanese fighters went down in the first 30 seconds of combat. But now the element of surprise was gone. The remaining Japanese pilots scattered, some diving away, others pulling into tight climbing turns. The neat formation dissolved into a swirling dogfight. Kirby pulled hard into a climbing turn, keeping his speed up. His training told him never to get slow, never to let the energy bleed off. An Oscar appeared in front of him, turning hard. The Japanese pilot was trying to get on Kirby's tail. Kirby rolled inverted, pulled through, and came out behind the Oscar instead. He fired. The Oscar's engine disintegrated. 4 down, the sky had become chaos. Aircraft everywhere, friend and enemy mixing in a 3-dimensional ballet of death. Tracers crossed the sky in every direction. Kirby kept his head on a swivel, checking 6 o'clock constantly, never fixating on a single target for too long. He saw Moore on the radio, calling for help. 2 Oscars were on his wingman's tail, closing fast. Kirby shoved the throttle forward and dove toward Moore's position. The Thunderbolt accelerated rapidly. He came in behind the trailing Oscar at over 400 miles per hour. His finger found the trigger. The .50 calibers roared. The Oscar disintegrated. 5 down. The second Oscar saw Kirby coming and broke hard right, trying to evade. But Kirby had the angle and the speed. He pulled lead, aimed where the Oscar would be, and fired. The tracers connected. The Oscar's wing folded. The fighter tumbled out of control, 6 down. Moore radioed his thanks and dove away, regaining energy. The fight had lasted maybe 2 minutes. It felt like hours. Kirby's ammunition counters showed he had fired nearly half his rounds. Fuel was getting critical. They needed to break off soon, but the Japanese pilots were not giving up. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt represented American industrial thinking at its most pragmatic. When Alexander Kartveli designed the aircraft for Republic Aviation in 1940, he ignored conventional wisdom about fighter design. European fighters like the Spitfire and Messerschmitt emphasized agility and lightweight. Kartveli went the opposite direction. He built the biggest, heaviest single-engine fighter anyone had ever seen. The prototype weighed over 12,000 pounds empty. Fully loaded, the P-47 tipped the scales at 17,000 pounds, more than 8 tons. Critics called it the flying milk jug. They said it was too big, too heavy, too clumsy to be an effective fighter. But Kartveli understood something his critics did not. Weight meant strength. Weight meant you could mount heavy armor around the cockpit. Weight meant you could install 8 .50 caliber machine guns with enough ammunition for sustained combat. Weight meant you could build a massive turbo supercharger system that would let the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine develop over 2,000 horsepower at altitude. The P-47 could not dance with enemy fighters at low altitude. It did not need to. It could climb to 40,000 feet, where the thin air left other fighters gasping for power. It could dive at speeds that approached the sound barrier. And it could absorb battle damage that would destroy any other fighter in the sky. The R2800 engine was a masterpiece of American engineering. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder displacing over 150 cubic inches. Air-cooled, which meant no vulnerable coolant system to leak when hit by enemy fire. The engine produced 2,535 horsepower in later versions with water injection for emergency power. That massive engine turned a 13-foot diameter propeller through a sophisticated turbocharger system that compressed thin, high-altitude air to sea-level density. The P-47 could cruise at 350 miles per hour and reach a top speed of 433 miles per hour in level flight. In a dive, with gravity assisting, the Thunderbolt could exceed 550 miles per hour. The armament was equally impressive. 8 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing. Each gun fired at 850 rounds per minute, which meant all 8 guns together put out over 6,800 rounds per minute. That was over 110 rounds per second. Each 50 caliber round weighed 1.7 ounces and left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the recoil was so powerful it could slow the aircraft by 35 miles per hour in level flight. Pilots reported that the first time they fired all 8 guns in combat, the shock surprised them. The noise was deafening even through the engine roar. The airframe shook, tracers reached out like fingers of light, and whatever those tracers touched usually exploded. But the P-47's real secret weapon was its toughness. The radial engine had no liquid cooling system to puncture. A Japanese pilot could shoot holes through the engine cylinders, and the Pratt & Whitney would keep running on the remaining cylinders. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The cockpit had armor plate behind the pilot's seat, armor plate on the sides, armor plate protecting the windscreen. The airframe was built like a bridge, with heavy structural members and redundant systems. P-47 pilots routinely brought their aircraft home with damage that would have downed any other fighter. Holes in the wings, chunks missing from the tail, engine cylinders blown away. The Thunderbolt absorbed it all and kept flying. Over WWII, Kirby was learning firsthand just how tough his aircraft really was. Japanese pilots were good, and they had numbers on their side. Tracers flashed past his canopy. He heard the distinctive crack of rounds hitting his aircraft. The Thunderbolt shuddered but kept flying. He pulled into a steep climbing turn, gaining altitude, forcing the Japanese fighters to follow him into the thin air where their engines lost power. The Oscars could turn inside him all day at low altitude, but up here at 20,000 feet, the turbocharged P-47 had the advantage. He leveled out, checked his 6, and dove again. This time, he targeted one of the twin-engine bombers. The big aircraft was trying to escape, heading east at full power. Kirby came down in a nearly vertical dive, building speed. The bomber grew larger in his gun sight. He opened fire at 600 yards. The heavy slugs hammered into the bomber's right engine. Fire erupted. The engine tore loose from its mount. The bomber nosed over and began its death spiral. Kirby pulled up hard, the G-forces graying out his vision momentarily. When his sight cleared, he was alone in empty sky. The Japanese formation had scattered. Some fighters were chasing Moore and Gallagher toward the coast. Others circled below, looking for targets. Kirby needed to get his flight together and get out. They had pushed their luck as far as it would go. But then he saw Dunham. The captain was in trouble. 2 Oscars were on his tail, firing steadily. Dunham's Thunderbolt trailed smoke. Kirby did not hesitate. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S, diving nearly straight down toward Dunham's position. The airspeed indicator climbed past 500 miles per hour. The controls stiffened. Compressibility effects were setting in. The P-47 was approaching speeds where the airflow over the wings began to exceed the speed of sound. Kirby ignored the shaking and the buffeting. He lined up the trailing Oscar and fired a long burst. The Japanese fighter simply disintegrated under the hammer blows of 50 caliber fire. 7 down. The second Oscar saw Kirby coming and broke away, climbing hard. Kirby followed, his superior speed letting him close the distance. The Oscar pilot was good. He reversed his turn, trying to get inside Kirby's circle. But Kirby had learned his lesson. He did not try to turn with the agile Japanese fighter. Instead, he rolled wings level and used his speed to zoom climb above the Oscar. Then he rolled inverted, pulled through, and came down on top of the enemy fighter. The Oscar pilot never saw him. Kirby fired from 100 yards. The Oscar burst into flames. 8 down. But the gun camera film had run out. No one would ever confirm that 8th kill. Kirby did not care. He was out of time and nearly out of fuel. He keyed his radio one more time. Brake for the clouds. The 4 Thunderbolts scattered, diving toward a layer of cumulus clouds to the east. Japanese fighters followed, but the P-47s had speed and the race was not close. Kirby and his flight plunged into the white safety of the clouds. When they emerged on the far side, the sky behind them was empty. The Japanese had given up the chase. The flight back towards Drome was tense. Fuel gauges hovered near empty. Engines ran rough from battle damage. But one by one, all 4 Thunderbolts touched down safely. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, counting holes, examining damage. Kirby climbed down from his cockpit, legs shaky from adrenaline drain. He had flown for over 3 hours and fought a running air battle for nearly an hour. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, despite the frigid high-altitude temperatures. Someone handed him a canteen. He drank deeply and tried to count how many enemy aircraft he had seen go down. The gun camera footage was developed immediately. Intelligence officers watched the film over and over, frame by frame. The images were clear and undeniable. Kirby had personally destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. His 3 wingmen had accounted for 3 more. 9 confirmed kills without a single American loss. It was the most successful single combat mission by American fighters in the Pacific Theater to that point. General Kenny immediately recommended Kirby for the Medal of Honor. General Douglas MacArthur personally presented the award to Kirby in a ceremony in January 1944. The citation described the action in formal military language. It spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. It detailed how Kirby had volunteered to lead a reconnaissance mission over strongly defended enemy bases, how he had gathered important tactical information, how he had then engaged a vastly superior enemy force despite low fuel and overwhelming odds, how he had personally destroyed 6 enemy aircraft and saved the life of his wingman, how he had led his flight safely home through enemy territory. The citation made it sound almost routine. The men who had been there knew different. What the citation did not mention was the fear. Every pilot felt it, though none would admit it. The moment when you look at your fuel gauge and realize you are deep in enemy airspace with barely enough gas to make it home. The moment when you see 48 enemy aircraft and your brain screams to run, but your training says attack. The moment when tracers flash past your canopy close enough to hear them crack. The moment when your wingman calls for help and you know that going to his aid means flying straight into a hornet's nest of enemy fighters. Every pilot knew that fear. The difference between heroes and everyone else was what you did with it. Kirby did not feel like a hero. He felt like a pilot who had done his job. He had trained his men well. They had executed their tactics properly. The P-47 had performed exactly as designed. The mission was successful. 9 enemy fighters destroyed, important intelligence gathered, all 4 American pilots returned safely. Those were the facts that mattered. The rest was just noise, but the story of that mission spread rapidly through the 5th Air Force. 4 P-47s against 48 Japanese aircraft. 9 kills, no losses. It was the kind of story that got told and retold in officers' clubs across the Pacific. It was the kind of story that made young pilots sit up and pay attention. It was the kind of story that changed perceptions. Before October 11, 1943, some pilots questioned the P-47. It was too big, too heavy, too expensive. The nimble P-38 Lightning could turn better. The later P-51 Mustang had longer range. Why did the Army Air Force waste resources building these massive Thunderbolts? After October 11th, those questions stopped. The Thunderbolt had proven itself in the most demanding test possible. Outnumbered 12-1, deep in enemy territory, low on fuel, the big fighters had not just survived. They had dominated. Japanese pilots had learned that engaging P-47s was suicide. The Americans would dive from above, strike with devastating firepower, and disappear before anyone could respond. Chase them and they would simply outrun you. Try to turn with them and they would zoom, climb out of reach and dive on you again. There was no answer to the Thunderbolt's combination of speed, altitude performance, and firepower. The tactical lessons from Kirby's mission became doctrine throughout the 5th Air Force. P-47s operated at high altitude, where their supercharged engines gave them advantage. They attacked in high-speed diving passes, using energy tactics rather than turning fights. They struck hard, broke off clean, and regained altitude before the enemy could respond. Pilots who tried to dogfight with Japanese fighters died. Pilots who followed Kirby's example survived and racked up kills. The difference was discipline and training. Know your aircraft's strengths. Know the enemy's weaknesses. Fight to your advantages. Never fight to the enemy's. It sounds obvious. In the chaos of aerial combat, with adrenaline surging and survival instinct screaming, obvious becomes nearly impossible. That was why training mattered. That was why leadership mattered. Kirby continued to fly combat missions even after his promotion to colonel and assignment to staff duties at 5th Air Force Fighter Command Headquarters. He could have stayed behind a desk. Most officers at his rank did, but Kirby was a fighter pilot first. He flew whenever he could, often leading missions himself. His victory count climbed steadily. By March 1944, he had 22 confirmed aerial victories. He was competing with Richard Bong for the title of top American ace in the Pacific Theater. Then, on March 5, 1944, Kirby led a 3-plane patrol over WWII. They intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers. Kirby shot down one bomber, then a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar got behind him. His wingmen shot down the Oscar, but not before it had put multiple rounds into Kirby's P-47. The Thunderbolt, tough as it was, could not absorb that level of damage. Kirby managed to bail out. Local people on the ground saw his parachute deploy. They saw him become entangled in a tree as he descended. They saw that he was already dead from wounds received in the attack. His body was not recovered until 1949. He was buried with full military honors at Hillcrest Memorial Park Cemetery in Dallas, Texas, on July 23, 1949. He was 32 years old when he died. He left behind a wife and 3 young sons. He left behind a legacy as one of the finest fighter pilots America produced in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt went on to become one of the most successful fighters of the war. American factories built 15,183 of them between 1942 and 1945. They served in every theater. They flew more than 500,000 combat missions. They destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. They destroyed thousands more on the ground. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored vehicles in ground attack missions. The loss rate was exceptionally low, just 0.7% per mission. The kill ratio was 4.6 to 1. For every Thunderbolt lost in air combat, P-47 pilots shot down more than 4 enemy aircraft. Those numbers made the P-47 one of the most cost-effective weapons America fielded in the war. But numbers never tell the full story. The real story of the P-47 is about the pilots who flew it. Men like Neil Kirby, who took an aircraft critics said was too heavy to be a fighter and proved them wrong. Men like Francis Gabreski, who shot down 31 enemy aircraft flying Thunderbolts. Men like Robert Johnson, who brought his battle-damaged P-47 home after taking multiple cannon hits that should have destroyed the aircraft. Men like thousands of other pilots whose names never made the history books, but who climbed into their Thunderbolts day after day, flew into hostile skies, and did their jobs with quiet courage and professional competence. The Thunderbolt was not the fastest fighter. It was not the most maneuverable. It was not the longest ranged. It was simply the toughest, most reliable, most survivable fighter bomber America produced in World War II. It was built by factory workers in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, and Buffalo, New York. It was designed by immigrants and flown by farm boys and city kids who learned to be warriors. It was maintained by ground crews who worked 18-hour days in tropical heat and winter cold to keep the big fighters flying. It was supported by a logistics system that spanned the globe, delivering spare parts and ammunition and fuel to remote airfields carved from jungle and desert. It was, in every sense, an American weapon, brutally practical, overwhelmingly powerful, tough enough to absorb punishment and keep fighting. That describes the aircraft. It also describes the men who flew it. The industrial capacity that produced the P-47 was itself a weapon. Germany and Japan could not match American production. The numbers were staggering. American factories built over 300,000 aircraft during World War II. They built 88,000 tanks. They built 2.4 million trucks. They built 6,500 naval vessels. They built 40 billion rounds of ammunition. This was not just manufacturing. This was industrial warfare on a scale the world had never seen. And it was decisive. Germany produced excellent aircraft like the Me-109 and FW-190. Japan produced agile fighters like the Zero and Oscar, but they produced them in thousands, while America produced tens of thousands. Quality matters. Quantity matters more when the quality is good enough. The P-47 was good enough. It was more than good enough. It was exactly what the American military needed when it needed it. A fighter that could escort bombers deep into Germany. A fighter that could survive the intense anti-aircraft fire over the battlefield and still deliver bombs and rockets on target. A fighter that could absorb battle damage and bring its pilot home. A fighter that could be produced in massive quantities without sacrificing reliability or performance. A fighter that transformed young men with minimal training into effective combat pilots in a matter of months rather than years. The P-47 did all of that and more. But the real transformation was not in the aircraft, or the tactics, or the production numbers. The real transformation was in the perception of air combat. Before pilots like Kirby proved otherwise, many believed that aerial warfare was about individual skill and aircraft agility. The best pilot in the most maneuverable aircraft would win. That was the lesson of World War I. That was the doctrine taught at air combat schools. That was what everyone believed. Kirby and the P-47 proved that doctrine wrong. Aerial warfare was not about turning and burning in dogfights. It was about energy management, altitude advantage, teamwork, and overwhelming firepower. It was about using the right tactics with the right aircraft against the right targets. It was about training, discipline, and mission execution. The Japanese pilots over WWII that October morning in 1943 were skilled and brave. Many had been flying combat missions since the war began in 1941. They knew their aircraft intimately. They had scored hundreds of victories against Allied fighters in the early months of the war. But skill and bravery were not enough against Kirby's systematic application of superior tactics and technology. The 4 Thunderbolts dove from altitude, struck with devastating firepower, and escaped before the Japanese could respond effectively. When Japanese pilots tried to pursue, the P-47s simply outdove them and outran them. When Japanese pilots tried to climb after the Americans, the turbocharged Thunderbolts left them behind in the thin air. The Japanese never had a chance. Not because they were poor pilots, because Kirby and his men had every advantage and knew how to use it. This is what modern warfare looks like. Not heroic individuals dueling in single combat, systematic application of technology, tactics, and training to achieve overwhelming advantage. The side with better intelligence attacks when and where the enemy is weakest. The side with better equipment exploits technical advantages ruthlessly. The side with better training executes complex maneuvers under stress. The side with better logistics maintains operational tempo that the enemy cannot match. Individual heroism still matters. Kirby's decision to attack despite the odds was heroic. His skill in aerial combat was exceptional. His leadership of his flight was exemplary. But heroism alone does not win wars. Heroism combined with superior technology, tactics, and resources wins wars. The lesson applies beyond World War II. Modern military forces spend vast resources on technology development, pilot training, and logistics precisely because these systemic advantages matter more than individual capabilities. An average pilot in a superior aircraft with good tactics will defeat an excellent pilot in an inferior aircraft every time. A small, well-trained, well-equipped force can defeat a much larger force that lacks those advantages. This is not theory. This is documented fact, proven over and over throughout history. Kirby's mission over WWII was just one example among thousands. But focusing solely on the technology and tactics misses something important: the human element. Kirby was not a machine executing programmed responses. He was a man making life and death decisions in real time under extreme stress. He chose to attack when every rational calculation said retreat. He chose to dive to his wingman's aid when he could have escaped safely. He chose to continue flying combat missions when he could have stayed safe behind a desk. These were human choices, driven by human motivations. Courage, loyalty, duty, pride, whatever you call it, that human element made the difference between a successful mission and a disaster. His 3 wingmen faced the same choices. Moore and Gallagher and Dunham could have broken formation when Kirby gave the order to attack. They could have pleaded engine trouble or low fuel or any of a dozen legitimate reasons to disengage. No one would have questioned their decision. But they followed Kirby into battle without hesitation. They trusted his judgment. They trusted their training. They trusted each other. That trust was built over months of flying together, training together, facing danger together. You cannot program that into a computer or buy it with a budget. You build it one mission at a time, one shared experience at a time, one moment of relying on your wingman and having him come through at a time. This is what separates professional military forces from armed mobs. The training builds skill. The equipment provides capability. But the shared hardship and mutual trust build cohesion. Cohesion is what keeps men advancing under fire when every instinct screams to take cover. Cohesion is what makes pilots follow their leader into impossible odds. Cohesion is what turns individuals into teams and teams into units that function smoothly under the worst possible conditions. The technology mattered, the tactics mattered, but ultimately, what mattered most was that 4 American pilots functioned as a single unit, each knowing his role, each trusting the others to do theirs, each willing to risk his life for his wingman. Kirby understood this. His leadership style emphasized teamwork and mutual support. He trained his pilots to fly as elements, 2 aircraft working together, covering each other, attacking in coordination. He trained his flights to operate as 4-ship formations, with defined roles and practice maneuvers. He trained his squadron to execute complex tactics that required precise timing and communication. That training paid off over WWII. When the fight started, no one panicked, no one froze. Each pilot executed his role. When someone called for help, someone responded. When Kirby gave orders, everyone followed them instantly. That level of coordination under combat stress does not happen by accident. It happens through training, leadership, and shared experience. The Germans had learned this lesson earlier in the war. Their fighter pilots operated in pairs, with a leader and a wingman. The leader did the attacking. The wingman protected his 6 o'clock. This rotor system proved far superior to the 3-ship formations everyone else used early in the war. The Americans adopted similar tactics, refined them, and added their own innovations. The P-47's radio equipment was superior to anything the Germans or Japanese had. American pilots could coordinate attacks, call for help, and share information in real time. This communication advantage multiplied the effectiveness of their tactics. A single flight of 4 P-47s could function with the coordination of a much larger formation because they had instant, clear communication. Technology again. But technology serving human needs. The radio let pilots do what they already wanted to do. Work together effectively. The P-47's toughness let pilots press attacks they would have broken off in frailer aircraft. The .850 caliber guns let pilots destroy targets with short bursts, conserving ammunition and minimizing exposure. Each technical feature supported tactical advantages which supported strategic goals. This is how successful military systems work. Not random collections of impressive technology, but integrated systems where each piece supports the others and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Kirby's mission demonstrated all of this in a single hour of combat. 4 aircraft operating as a coordinated team, superior altitude performance used to gain advantageous position, devastating firepower applied in high-speed passes, mutual support when one pilot got in trouble, disciplined disengagement when the time came to leave, and underlying everything, the toughness and reliability of the Thunderbolt, absorbing battle damage and bringing everyone home. It was combined arms at the tactical level. It was integration of technology and training. It was proof that the American approach to aerial warfare worked. The impact extended beyond one mission. Every pilot in the 5th Air Force heard about Kirby's success. The story spread through the fighter groups like wildfire. If Kirby could take on 48 Japanese aircraft and win, what could a full squadron accomplish? What could a fighter group do? The psychological impact on American morale was enormous. The psychological impact on Japanese morale was devastating. Japanese pilots had enjoyed air superiority in the early years of the war. Now they were being systematically hunted by American fighters that they could not match. The initiative had shifted. The Japanese were reacting to American attacks rather than conducting their own offensive operations. This shift in initiative eventually became one of the key factors in Allied victory in the Pacific. Wars are not won by single missions or individual heroes. Wars are won by sustained application of superior resources over time. But individual missions matter because they demonstrate what is possible. Individual heroes matter because they inspire others to match their courage and skill. Kirby's mission over WWII mattered because it proved the P-47's capabilities in combat. It validated the tactics the Americans were teaching. It demonstrated that disciplined execution of proper tactics with good equipment could overcome seemingly impossible odds. And it gave American pilots confidence that they could win. Confidence matters in combat. The side that believes it will win often does win, even when the objective factors are equal. The side that fears it will lose often does lose, even when it should win. This is not mysticism. This is human psychology. Confident troops take calculated risks. They press attacks. They exploit opportunities. Fearful troops hesitate. They break off prematurely. They miss chances. Over the course of hundreds of missions and thousands of individual combat engagements, that difference in psychology produces measurably different outcomes. Kirby's mission gave American pilots reason for confidence. It gave Japanese pilots reason for fear. That psychological shift was worth far more than the 9 aircraft destroyed that day. The aftermath of the October 11th mission rippled through both air forces. American pilots studied the gun camera footage and learned from it. They saw how Kirby had used altitude and speed. They saw how he had avoided turning fights. They saw how he had maintained situational awareness throughout the combat. They saw how he had coordinated with his wingmen, and they tried to emulate those techniques in their own missions. Japanese pilots studied their losses and tried to develop counter-tactics, but there was no good answer to the P-47's advantages at altitude. The only effective Japanese counter was to avoid combat with the Americans entirely. Stay on the ground until the Thunderbolts passed. Launch strikes at night when American fighters could not intercept. Attack targets where fighter escort was weak. These were defensive tactics, and they marked Japan's transition from offensive to defensive posture in the air war. The strategic implications were profound. Control of the air meant control of the battlefield. American bombers could strike Japanese bases, supply lines, and troop concentrations without significant opposition. American reconnaissance aircraft could photograph enemy positions and movements freely. American transport aircraft could supply ground forces without fear of interception. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft were increasingly confined to defensive operations, reacting to American initiatives rather than conducting their own offensive missions. This air superiority directly contributed to American success in ground campaigns throughout New Guinea and the Philippines. Ground commanders could request air support and receive it promptly. They could move supplies by air without losing transports to enemy fighters. They could plan operations knowing that enemy airstrikes were unlikely. The production numbers tell part of the story. By 1944, American factories were producing aircraft at rates the Japanese could not match. Grumman alone built over 12,000 fighters during the war years. Republic built more than 15,000 Thunderbolts. North American built over 15,000 Mustangs. The numbers were staggering. Japanese production of all combat aircraft combined never exceeded 28,000 in the entire war. American production exceeded that in 1944 alone. This production differential meant that American losses could be quickly replaced. Japanese losses could not. An American fighter squadron that lost 3 aircraft in combat would have replacements within days. A Japanese squadron that lost 3 aircraft might wait months for replacements, if they came at all. Pilot training followed the same pattern. American flight schools graduated thousands of new pilots every month. Training was thorough, with hundreds of hours of flight time before a pilot entered combat. The curriculum included gunnery practice, formation flying, navigation, instrument flying, and tactical training. By the time a pilot climbed into a P-47 for his first combat mission, he had already logged more flight hours than many experienced Japanese pilots. And if he survived his first few missions, his experience level increased rapidly. American pilots flew tours of 50 missions, then rotated home to train new pilots or rest before returning for another tour. This rotation system preserved experienced pilots and spread their knowledge throughout the force. Japanese pilot training collapsed as the war progressed. Early in the war, Japanese naval aviators received excellent training. They flew for years before seeing combat. They practiced constantly. They became exceptional pilots. But these experienced pilots died in combat, and the training system could not replace them fast enough. By 1944, Japanese pilots were entering combat with minimal training. Some had less than 100 hours of total flight time. They had never practiced gunnery against a moving target. They had never flown formation in bad weather. They had never experienced the disorientation and sensory overload of actual combat. When these inexperienced pilots encountered veterans like Kirby and superior aircraft, the outcome was predetermined. This is how wars of attrition work. The side with greater resources can afford losses that the other side cannot. America lost over 95,000 aircraft during World War II. That number includes training accidents, operational losses, and combat losses. It is a staggering total. But American industry produced over 300,000 aircraft, so losses could be sustained. Japan lost approximately 50,000 aircraft. Japanese industry produced approximately 76,000 aircraft total. The loss rate was unsustainable. By late 1944, the Japanese Air Force was a shadow of its former strength. Experienced pilots were dead or grounded for lack of fuel and spare parts. Replacement pilots lacked training and experience. Aircraft quality had declined as Japan diverted resources to more desperate measures like kamikaze attacks. The kamikaze campaign itself was an acknowledgement of Japanese air inferiority. When your pilots cannot survive long enough in combat to effectively attack enemy ships, you design tactics that require pilots to commit suicide. It is a measure of desperation, not strength. The kamikazes inflicted casualties and damaged ships, but they could not reverse the strategic situation. American ships kept coming. American aircraft kept dominating the skies. American ground forces kept advancing. The suicide attacks were militarily ineffective and morally repugnant, but they were all Japan had left. This was the end result of the process that began when pilots like Kirby demonstrated American air superiority in places like WWII. Individual actions accumulate into strategic results. One mission does not win a war, but hundreds of successful missions, flown by dozens of squadrons, over the course of months and years, produced decisive effects. Kirby's mission on October 11 was one of thousands flown by 5th Air Force fighters in the Southwest Pacific. Each mission chipped away at Japanese air strength. Each loss forced Japanese commanders to pull their forces further back, to husband their remaining aircraft, to avoid combat, except under the most favorable circumstances. This gradual degradation of enemy capability is how wars are won. Not in single dramatic battles, though those happen, but in sustained operations over time, applying superior resources consistently until the enemy can no longer resist effectively. The individual stories matter because they remind us that wars are fought by people, not statistics. When we say the 5th Air Force flew 10,000 sorties and destroyed 500 enemy aircraft, we are talking about thousands of young men who climbed into their aircraft day after day, flew into hostile skies and risked their lives. Some became aces, most did not. Some received medals, most just did their jobs and went home when the war ended. Some died in combat, others survived, but carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Each one has a story. Kirby's story became famous because he received the Medal of Honor, and because his October 11th mission was so dramatically successful. But his story is representative of thousands of other stories that never got told. The ground crews who maintained the P-47s have their own stories. These men worked in terrible conditions, often outdoors in tropical heat or freezing cold. They worked 18-hour days when operations demanded it. They improvised repairs with whatever materials were available. They scavenged parts from wrecked aircraft to keep others flying. They loaded ammunition and bombs. They patched battle damage. They changed engines in the field. They did all of this, knowing that the aircraft they maintained would be flown into combat within hours, and that the pilot's survival might depend on how well they had done their job. The responsibility was crushing. The work was exhausting. The recognition was minimal. But without these ground crews, the aircraft sat idle, and the missions did not fly. The logistics personnel have their own stories. Someone had to transport thousands of tons of aviation fuel from refineries in the United States to forward airfields in New Guinea. Someone had to ship millions of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition across the Pacific. Someone had to requisition spare parts, schedule cargo space on transport ships, coordinate with port authorities, manage inventory, track shipments, and ensure that the right materials arrived at the right place at the right time. Logistics is not glamorous. It does not appear in war movies, but it is absolutely essential. An air force without fuel and ammunition cannot fight, no matter how good its aircraft or how skilled its pilots. The intelligence personnel have their own stories. Someone had to analyze reconnaissance photos to identify enemy airfields and estimate aircraft numbers. Someone had to interrogate captured Japanese pilots to learn about enemy tactics and capabilities. Someone had to compile mission reports from returning pilots and extract useful tactical information. Someone had to brief pilots before missions about expected enemy strength and dispositions. Someone had to plot enemy movements on maps and predict where Japanese forces would be. Good intelligence meant American fighters intercepted enemy formations. Poor intelligence meant fighters wasted fuel searching empty skies. The difference was often measured in lives saved or lost. This is the reality of modern warfare. Combat is the visible part, the dramatic moment when planes fight and bombs fall and ships sink. But combat is supported by vast invisible structures of logistics, maintenance, intelligence, training, and administration. These supporting functions are not glamorous, but they are decisive. Kirby's mission succeeded, not just because he was skilled and brave. It succeeded because his P-47 had been properly maintained, because his guns had been loaded with good ammunition, because he had received accurate intelligence about enemy dispositions, because he had fuel in his tanks that had been shipped halfway around the world, because he had been trained in tactics that had been developed through analysis of hundreds of previous combats. All of these factors contributed to the outcome. Understanding this broader context does not diminish Kirby's achievement. If anything, it makes his accomplishment more impressive. He took all the advantages his side provided and used them perfectly. He made no mistakes in a situation where any mistake would have been fatal. He led his men with courage and skill. He achieved a victory that seemed impossible, but he did not achieve that victory alone. He was the point of the spear, but behind him stood the entire American military-industrial complex. That combination of individual excellence and systemic support is what made American forces so effective in World War II. The same pattern appeared in every theater of the war. In Europe, American and British bombers struck German industry in daylight raids that earlier would have been suicidal. But by 1944, they flew with massive fighter escorts of P-47s, P-51s, and P-38s that destroyed the Luftwaffe in the air. German fighters that rose to intercept the bombers had to fight through swarms of American fighters. German pilots who survived one mission faced the same odds the next day and the day after that. The attrition was unsustainable. German pilot losses mounted. Training programs could not replace them. Aircraft production continued, but sat idle for lack of qualified pilots. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe barely existed as an effective fighting force. In the Pacific, the pattern was similar, but more dramatic. American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines, sinking merchant ships faster than Japan could build them. American carrier task forces struck Japanese bases with impunity, destroying aircraft on the ground and ships in harbor. American bombers burned Japanese cities with incendiary attacks that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The atomic bombs that ended the war were just the culmination of a strategic bombing campaign that had already reduced much of Japan's industrial capacity to rubble. The Japanese people faced starvation as the blockade cut off food imports. The Japanese military faced defeat as its ability to supply and reinforce its forces collapsed. These outcomes were not inevitable. In 1942, Japan controlled vast territories and possessed formidable military forces. Germany controlled most of Europe and seemed poised to conquer the Soviet Union. The Axis powers had experienced leaders, combat-tested troops, and sophisticated equipment. They had achieved stunning victories against opponents who supposedly had superior resources. The Allied victory required years of hard fighting, millions of casualties, and vast expenditures of blood and treasure. But ultimately, resources prevailed. The side with more people, more industry, more raw materials, and more food won by applying those advantages systematically over time. Individual battles could be lost. Individual campaigns could fail. But as long as the industrial base remained intact and the political will remained firm, America and its allies could afford losses and continue fighting. Germany and Japan could not. They had finite resources that dwindled with each passing month. They had populations that could not sustain endless casualties. They had industries that could not match Allied production. And they faced opponents who learned from their mistakes and adapted their tactics while the Axis powers remained rigid in their thinking. The outcome, given enough time, was certain, but time was measured in lives. Every day the war continued, people died. Soldiers in combat, civilians in bombed cities, prisoners in camps, people starving in besieged cities, people dying of disease in refugee columns. The human cost was almost incomprehensible. World War II killed over 60 million people. That number is so large it becomes abstract. Try to imagine 60 million individual human beings, each with a name, a family, hopes and dreams and fears, each one dead because of decisions made by political leaders who sent armies to conquer foreign lands. The scale of the tragedy is beyond easy comprehension. This is why the story of Kirby's mission matters, not just as an exciting tale of aerial combat, not just as an example of courage and skill, but as a reminder that war is fought by individuals, each one making choices, each one facing danger, each one human. Kirby chose to attack when he could have fled. That choice led to victory and medals and fame. It also eventually led to his death in combat 9 months later. Was it worth it? There is no good answer to that question. Kirby believed in his mission. He believed in his country. He believed in his duty. He made his choice knowing the risks. Thousands of other men made similar choices. Some survived. Many did not. Their sacrifice ended the threat of Axis conquest. It liberated millions of people from occupation and oppression. It destroyed regimes that had committed unspeakable atrocities. These are real accomplishments that justified the struggle, but the cost was terrible, and we should never forget that cost. We should never romanticize war or pretend that it is anything other than organized violence on a massive scale. We can honor courage without celebrating killing. We can acknowledge achievement without glorifying destruction. We can remember the necessity of the fight without pretending it was anything other than tragic. The P-47 Thunderbolt was retired from American service shortly after the war ended. Jet aircraft had already appeared and would soon make propeller-driven fighters obsolete. But the Thunderbolt continued flying with foreign air forces for years. The Brazilian Air Force flew P-47s until 1954. The Peruvian Air Force kept them until 1966. A few examples remained in service with smaller air forces into the 1970s. Today, fewer than 30 P-47s still exist in flying condition. They appear at air shows, reminders of a vanished era when the sky was filled with the thunder of massive piston engines and the rattle of 50 caliber machine guns. When one of these restored Thunderbolts flies overhead, Listen to that sound. That deep, powerful roar from the R-2800 engine. Imagine hearing that sound multiplied by dozens of aircraft, a formation of Thunderbolts heading out on a mission. Imagine being a German soldier and hearing that sound approaching, knowing that tons of bombs and rockets were about to rain down. Imagine being an American infantryman and hearing that sound, knowing that friendly fighters were overhead providing cover. That sound meant something to the people who heard it during the war. It meant hope or fear depending on which side you were on. It meant the arrival of devastating firepower applied with precision. It meant American industrial might made manifest in a machine that dominated the skies. The story of Neil Kirby and his Thunderbolt on October 11, 1943, is ultimately a story about choices and consequences. Kirby chose to attack. That choice led to victory, but also exposed him and his men to deadly risk. The Japanese chose to engage rather than flee. That choice cost them 9 aircraft and their tactical advantage in the area. American leaders chose to invest in heavy, powerful fighters like the P-47. That choice paid dividends in combat effectiveness and pilot survival. Japanese leaders chose not to match American industrial output. That choice doomed their war effort. Every war consists of millions of such choices, large and small, made by individuals from privates to generals to political leaders. The accumulated effect of those choices determines outcomes. We study these stories not to glorify war, but to understand it. Understanding helps us avoid repeating the mistakes that lead to war. Understanding helps us appreciate the courage of those who fought when fighting was necessary. Understanding helps us honor their memory by working to build a world where such sacrifices are not required. The men who flew Thunderbolts over New Guinea are mostly gone now. The last veterans of World War II are in their late 90s or older. Soon, there will be no one left who personally experienced that conflict. Their stories will remain, preserved in books and films and documentaries like this one. Those stories are our responsibility now. We must tell them accurately, respectfully, and thoughtfully, so that future generations understand what was sacrificed and why it mattered. The sky above WWII is quiet now. Commercial aircraft occasionally pass overhead, carrying tourists to tropical beaches. The old Japanese airfields are overgrown, reclaimed by jungle. The wrecks of aircraft that crashed during the war slowly corrode in the humid air, rusting monuments to forgotten battles. No one in WWII today gives much thought to what happened in that sky on October 11, 1943. But for 1 hour on that morning, 4 American pilots in massive Thunderbolts engaged in mortal combat with dozens of Japanese fighters. The outcome of that fight rippled through both air forces and contributed in a small way to the eventual Allied victory. The story deserves to be remembered, not for its drama or excitement, but for what it reveals about courage, skill, technology, and the human capacity for both extraordinary achievement and terrible destruction.